Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here and for your testimony today. I want to be clear at the outset. There are good reasons for us to have concerns about the application of this law. The American people have long understood that the power of government can easily be abused. A special committee of the United States Senate concluded a few years ago, about 40 years ago, that in every presidential administration from FDR all the way through Nixon, the administration immediately preceding the work of that special committee, the intelligence gathering agencies of the federal government had been used to engage in political espionage. This is, of course, very significant. It's of obvious concern to anyone who works in this city or in government in any way. In addition to that, there is a reason why we have the Fourth Amendment. There are all kinds of implications that extend far beyond the political realm, where the rights of the accused need to be protected. And notwithstanding the fact that we want government to be able to do its job to protect us from those outside our country who would harm us, we also want to make sure that those same authorities can't be used to harm individuals. The Fourth Amendment, in fact, makes government less efficient. It, in fact, makes it more difficult to be the government. But it's also very, very necessary. In any administration, regardless of which political party is at the head of it, it's important that we not lose touch with the Fourth Amendment, either the letter or spirit thereof. Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act amendments authorizes the surveillance of certain foreign intelligence activities. That definition includes information that is directly related to things like national security and national defense, things that are directly related, for example, to a potential terrorist attack. But it also includes information that, quote, is relevant to the foreign affairs of the United States, close quote. This latter category is broad, is much broader, and it is broad enough, I think, to be used to target just about anyone abroad, including a political activist, a human rights volunteer, business people, students, journalists, doctors, just about anyone traveling abroad. At a hearing before this committee earlier this year, the FBI director testified that it would not be problematic for the FBI to limit collection of foreign intelligence information to information that is itself limited much more to the national security universe. So let me start by asking Mr. Evans and Mr. Brooker, would this be problematic? Is there any reason why we couldn't and shouldn't limit the use of Section 702 to something that's related to a national security threat?
Thank you, Senator. I am familiar with the exchange you had with then Director Comey during that prior hearing, and while I certainly can't speak for what he was thinking with his answer, as I understood his answer, I think he was referring to the FBI's use of Section 702, which, as Mr. Gaddis described, the FBI can only receive Section 702 information when it's part of an authorized investigation that they're conducting, which typically relate to the types of threats that Director Comey described. As to talking about potentially changing the definition of foreign intelligence information more broadly, I think that's something that would be difficult to do in an open session here without having the ability in a classified session, which we could certainly get into tomorrow, to describe for you the specific types of collection that are ongoing now and how any potential changes to the definition of foreign intelligence might affect that.
Well, is Section 702 currently used abroad to target people who are themselves not related to national security threats?
Section 702, and I'll just walk through the statute here briefly. Section 702 can be used, as you noted, to collect on foreign intelligence information as that's defined by statute. Now, within that definition, there are certifications executed by the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence that describe the specific types of foreign intelligence information appropriate for collection. Those specific categories in those certifications are classified, so I can't get into them here. But importantly, though, as to your point about targeting any innocent foreigner overseas, as Mr. Morris indicated, I think in his opening remark, a foreigner overseas can only be targeted under Section 702 if there's a reasonable belief that that person is likely to communicate or possess foreign intelligence information as it relates to one of the specific certifications. That justification, laying out why that person is reasonably likely to communicate or possess that information, has to be documented by the analyst and then is subject to back-end auditing by the Department of Justice and Director of National Intelligence to ensure that it's appropriate and related to the actual topic of the certification.
Okay. What kinds of concerns does it raise when you've got somebody doing a backdoor search, whether they use it or not? Why is that a problem?
Oh, I see your point. Well, I think the point is that the search itself is a violation of Americans' privacy. That's the heart of the Fourth Amendment, is that the government has to have a warrant before intruding on an American's reasonable expectation of privacy. And whether or not they find something as a result of that does not affect the privacy intrusion. It has other effects, potentially. But if the government enters your house without a warrant and doesn't find anything, there's no argument there that somehow your privacy wasn't invaded because the search was fruitless. So I think we have to understand the nature of the privacy intrusion when the government is allowed to search Americans' communications without a warrant.
What kinds of things can information be used for? What kinds of investigations could incorporate information obtained through a backdoor search?
Well, we don't know exactly for a couple of reasons. One reason is because the list of crimes unrelated to national security that the Department of Justice is authorized to use Section 702 data when prosecuting, that list is not public. All we know is that it's serious crimes, but we don't know which crimes those are, and despite repeated requests, that information has not been made public. The other reason we don't know is because the government has had spotty compliance at best with the statutory requirement that it notify criminal defendants when using evidence obtained or derived from Section 702. The government's interpretation of derived from appears to be quite generous, perhaps creative, but once again, the department has refused to make that interpretation public. It's fighting FOIA requests for that interpretation tooth and nail. What we do know is that there were no notifications given at all until 2013. And then when the government was essentially caught telling the Supreme Court that it notifies defendants when it doesn't, it changed its practices. Since then, I think there have been 8 cases in which there were notifications, despite the fact that the FBI routinely searches Section 702 data certainly in national security cases, and there have been hundreds of national security prosecutions during this time. So we have an information deficit here.
In fact, we don't really know. We don't really have any idea how often this occurs. And your organization recently signed a letter to the Director of National Intelligence expressing dismay as to why he was choosing not to provide an estimate as to the number of Americans who are subject to these.
Yes, and if I could, I would like very much to speak to the notion that this is somehow infeasible, or at least not without drastically violating Americans' privacy. There are 3 kinds of collection under 702. The first is collection of telephone calls. It is a simple matter to estimate whether someone on one end of the call is an American, and that's by looking at the country code. It's not perfect, but we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for an exact count. We're looking for an estimate. It is certainly sufficient for that purpose and involves no privacy intrusion. The second kind of collection is upstream internet collection. When the government conducts this kind of collection, it must first run a filter to try to filter out wholly domestic communications. It doesn't do this by doing a lot of research that invades Americans' privacy. It does this using IP addresses and some comparable technical means. That's what the PCLAB reported. And in doing so, it manages to filter out enough domestic communications that it can comply with the Constitution. So if this method of determining the American versus foreign status of a communicant is sufficient for purposes of complying with the Constitution, I think it should be sufficient for purposes of giving Americans a rough sense of how many of their communications are collected.
Sure.
The third program is where there are more complicated issues. But even for that program, the privacy community is unanimous in saying that conducting a one-time limited sampling under careful conditions would be a net privacy gain.
Oh, thank you. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit that letter that I referenced a moment ago for the record. As the letter notes, Senator Wyden has been requesting this information since 2011. The House Judiciary Committee and privacy groups have been requesting that information now for nearly 2 years. And members of the House of Representatives were promised, I believe, by Director Clapper and Director Coates that the estimate would be forthcoming. So we have yet to receive that information. And it sounds like you certainly share my concern with the fact that notwithstanding those assurances and notwithstanding the public interest in this, there's no information yet.
There's no information, but there was a lot of progress. Under the previous administration, there were several meetings that the intelligence community had with House members, with members of civil society, in which they discussed methodologies they were considering. There was a tremendous amount of progress on this, and the letter from members of the House Judiciary Committee confirmed their understanding that the administration had committed to providing that number in early 2017, hopefully by January. And in fact, all accounts, public and private, suggest that they were on the verge of launching that count towards the end of last year. We've had a change of administration, and the government has now backed off of its commitment to provide that information.